And of course, my colleague, Professor Fethi Mansouri, who is Deakin Distinguished Professor and is the founding director of the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization. There's a lot that can be said about Fethi. He literally needs no introduction to this room, I think, just that he's Australia's leading expert on the topic we're discussing tonight. So it's a really nice moment to have this concentration of expertise. Not just expertise in a dry academic way, as you'll see, but expertise in a way that's very focused on society and policy and practical things. But before I continue, I want to ask Ahmed Keskin to introduce some of our distinguished visitors and say a bit about this event.
Thank you. I won't take up too much time. Firstly, I just want to say thank you to ADI, Professor Fethi, for accepting or allowing this event to take place. Joining Dr. Koutoulas we have a delegation from Greece, of which he is one. We also have Ms. Katerina Markou, who is a former MP of the Greek Parliament, served 2 terms and now runs a publishing house. And we also have Ms. Georgia Lagou from Antenna TV and Hassan Kochanja, who are visiting us, the Australian Intercultural Society, who we're hosting. And we also just wanted to make a special mention to the Chief Justice of South Australia, Justice Chris Kourakos, who is also here joining us today. So thank you again. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed Davi. I'm tempted to say a lot more, but that would be wasting the time that we have, which is limited, as I've said. So the format is we have a brief series of opening statements from each of our 3 panelists. We'll then talk about the issues that they've set out. And at about 45 minutes mark, I'll ask you to be ready with some questions and some observations. As I said, it's invariably the case that with these short and sweet conversational formats, we get to the 90-minute mark just comfortably warmed up and ready to get into a good conversation. I'm just forewarning you of that because we'll run out of time. But these conversational discussions work so well to unpack really pressing issues. I'm sure that's going to be the case here. So perhaps, Karen, you might like to lead off with some opening reflections, just in terms of work you've been doing, but also what you would like to focus on in the conversation here.
So I'd like to just talk a little bit about where we are in Australia in terms of our migration policy. As most people in the room know, Australia was settled by Europeans who came here and found land with people on it and appropriated that land. The indigenous people never ceded their land, but it was forcibly taken from them. The European settlers, the British settlers who came here, decided that the people weren't people and legislated themselves into power. There were always people coming back and forth here, particularly in the north of Australia. They weren't the first people to migrate here, but they did change everything in that appropriation of the land through the myth of terra nullius, or that the land was empty. They appropriated the land around an ideology of white supremacy and a white Australia. And I don't say that lightly. It was actually literally the law of the land. The 2 different aspects of that were the dispossession of the indigenous inhabitants of the land, but also the way that migration was managed. So one of the first laws that was passed in the Australian Parliament when it became a federation was the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, which is a white Australia policy. So explicitly a white Australia, Australia for white people being defined as Anglo-Celtic people, British people, people of a particular kind of whiteness. And that shaped migration, which is organized through the migration regime until the 1970s when it shifted to multiculturalism. And I think Australia is such a fascinating place because up until the 1970s, it really had been all about whiteness and maintaining whiteness, a British outpost. The kind of European migrants that were allowed to come here were people who looked white and were expected to become white over time. And that whiteness was a particular British sort of whiteness. It was, again, cultural homogeneity. So people would assimilate into the dominant culture and become white in the Australian sense. In the 1970s, there were a bunch of pressures on Australia to stop having their racist immigration policy. And things shifted under the Whitlam government to a policy of multiculturalism. This is a really different way of organizing your social cohesion. So you've been organizing your social cohesion around this idea of cultural homogeneity, of whiteness, and now you're shifting it to an idea multiculturalism as a way that everyone can be here and can practice their faith, practice their culture, but we still come together as Australians. We respect each other and we have responsibilities to each other. And governments put in place a bunch of programs to support multicultural communities in the 1970s. And we are still ostensibly organized around this ideology of multiculturalism. But I'd say probably towards the end of the 1990s, when the Howard government came in, it shifted to a kind of a more neoliberal approach, multiculturalism, and discourses around we get to choose who comes here, and citizenship tests, testing your Aussiness in your citizenship test, and deporting people who were criminals, even if they've been here their whole lives, start to kind of creep in. And there's not the same kind of vision being put forward by governments around social cohesion that there was at those key other times. At the moment, we're having discussions, in the higher education sector around international student caps, and we need to have fewer international students. And you think to yourself, why? And how does this help our social cohesion? How does this take us to the next stage? How do we envision ourselves a nation of settlers on stolen Aboriginal land? But 97% of us are settlers here. How do we have our social cohesion? What is the vision going forward? And I think I'll just say I think it's a bit lacking at the moment. So I haven't talked about my research, but which at the moment I'm looking at racism in sport, but also the social, the economic and social and agency of Africans in Australia, which is front of mind around racism. So how do we be a welcoming country where people can come and be safe and welcomed? But I was talking beforehand to Jonas around Australia having the reputation of being a really successful multicultural society. And we really are. It's peaceful. People live in pretty much good harmony here. How do we maintain that going forward? I'll stop there.
Excellent summary. I mean, that sets up the whole conversation. Fetty, you've got a few thoughts on this, I think.
Thank you, Greg. And look, thanks and welcome everyone to ADI and to Deakin Downtown. I think Karen has very much provided us with a very good overview in terms of historical context of how migration has been looked at in the Australian context. And it's only very fitting that she referred to the 1901 first act of the then federal parliament, which was to legislate what they called at the time the Migration Restriction Act, which later became known as the White Australia Policy. If you want to understand migration as an issue of public interest in Australia, and then research, of course, you just need to think about a couple of key events that we can refer to in terms of how they were phrased. So initially, as you know, we were as we produced that first Act of Parliament in 1901, Migration Restriction Act, the mantra was the yellow peril. So we looked at people from the north of Australia, in particular Asians and Chinese more specifically, and we framed the whole restriction introduced by our parliament, which was just a nation parliament, just being really set up, as we need to put everything possible legislatively speaking, in place so that we are able to deal with what was termed at that time as the yellow peril. That is, we wanted to preserve the whiteness of this colony. We wanted to preserve the core Anglo-Celtic nature of that whiteness, not just whiteness, but the core Anglo-Celtic nature of that whiteness. And one way of doing that is to legislate for who would be welcomed as a migrant and who would not be welcomed as a migrant. And so let's establish that as part of a legislative framework. That remained very relevant all the way through the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. But what happened in the 40s and the 50s is, following World War II, is Australia knew that as essentially an outpost of white settlement in the middle of the Asia Pacific region, it could not really sustain its own viability economically, demographically, politically, geostrategically even, with such a small population. So that yellow peril then became populate or perish. So the mantra in the 50s and the 60s became, no, we need to grow our population. So, but how can we grow the population if we are putting these restrictions in place in terms of who comes into Australia? It's at that time that we started to see Southern Europeans being welcomed into Australia as a source of migrants. So the Greeks, and we're very proud of Melbourne being the second largest Greek city in the whole world, by the way, after Athens, and the Italians, and later on, the people from former Yugoslavia, and later on Turkish, etc. So that populate or perish is what drove migration programs to grow in that period. But that raised a big challenge. We are no longer able to preserve that pure white demography and culture that is based and anchored within an Anglo-Celtic core. And I think that, in conjunction with events happening elsewhere, and here I would like to perhaps refresh our own collective memory, that in the 60s, we had the global movement for social justice, civil rights movement in the US in particular, where race and gender justice movements were growing, where people were wanting to eliminate racism and gender inequalities and discrimination in so many forms, and anti-colonial movements were really gathering momentum. So it coincided with that period of emancipatory ideologies. That is what led really to Australia in the early 70s embracing multiculturalism as a framework and as a basis for social policy. And we thought that would be the answer to all our problems. Of course, it wasn't, because even though we embedded some key infrastructure around multiculturalism, MRCs, migrant resource centers, school language programs, interpreting and translating services, you name it. We actually put a very interesting infrastructure for multiculturalism. We even enacted the first Race Discrimination Act in 1975 to minimize racism. What really did not happen, and perhaps we'll pick up on this later in the conversation, is we remained very much dealing with multiculturalism and diversity as a surface level issue that did not need to be picked up within deep structure, what we call deep diversity, yeah? So we're dealing with diversity at this level, providing services that allow and facilitate integration, but never really wanted to reform institutionally so that we move from a multicultural society, so to speak, to a genuinely multicultural state. And when I say multicultural state, I mean institutions functioning in a way that reflect the multiculturalism of the nation. Remember that multiculturalism is demographic, multiculturalism is also in relation to policy, and multiculturalism is deeper, is about ideology and is about institutions. And that is really where we are right now. We are still coming to grips with the failure to elevate multiculturalism from a demographic level of playing field to a state of affairs that penetrates deep into state structures and institutions. And this is why, and I will stop in a minute, this is why when you look at some of the research that's been done recently, or the work that's been done by the Australian Human Rights Commission, they looked at corporate Australia, they looked at senior exec in universities, they looked at a number of key institutions, and guess what? A lot of those institutions are still 98% of them in terms of leadership is white, and more than 90% is Anglo-Celtic white. I'm talking about ASX listed companies, and I'm talking about senior exec leadership roles in universities. That is not happening by accident. That is happening because the vestiges of power have not been shaken enough to reflect the country that we are today. So, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Fethi. Ioannis, I hope that's a brilliant introduction from our two panelists about where we're at in Australia. Very much an unfinished project, lots of challenges, not without grounds for optimism, but lots of work to be done. But I mean, the European story is older and equally as rich. So please lead off. And
good evening, everybody. My name is Ioannis. Okay, thanks. So I'm a lecturer in history, international relations at the University of Athens. And I'm here to speak about our experience of handling migration and refugee issue in Europe. As you know, it's a hotly contested issue in Europe. And it has shaped public perception, it has shaped policies. And of course, European Union is a different case than Australia regarding, of course, its structure and the fact that it's a coalition of many states. So you have to have different levels of cooperation. You have contradicting views. And I can focus, if you like, on the Greek case, because it's been really unique in the sense that Greece is a country with a very special geography. Greece has a unique geography in the sense that it has a lot of islands. It has 10,000 islands. 260 of these are inhabited. Its borders are really close to Turkey, and you can get into Greece rather easily with a boat. So it's been all over the news. Greece is the gateway for migration into the European Union. And there is this interplay between, of course, human rights, migration, refugees, security, the whole discourse, but also it works out on additional levels like relations between Greece and other EU member states, relations between nation states of Europe and, let's say, the EU mechanism in Brussels, some sort, of proto-federal structure, acting sometimes not in unison with individual states. So this is a very complex issue in Europe in whole. And as you know, there is, of course, it's a wholly contested issue. It shapes political outcomes. You may have seen the results recently in Germany, where I think this week there was an election, a local election in German state, in Thuringia and in Saxony. And the anti-immigration party was first in Thuringia and second only for a slight margin, AfD. So you have this interplay of migration, identity, and security in Europe that has become the focal issue in European politics. Now, coming back to Greece, as I told you, Greece has this geographic peculiarity. If you take the coastline of Greece and actually extend it, it's a little bit smaller than Australia's. It may seem improbable, but Greece has a coastline 16,000 kilometers. So it's because it's really indented geographically, a lot of inlets, a lot of islands. So this means that there is a lot of access towards the sea, from the sea. So Greece was, as you know, a nation of emigrants. And on a personal note, I was born in Australia. My parents were migrants back in the 1960s. They came. I was born in Sydney. We were living in Marrickville. Later, they returned. So this is also a personal instance for me here. Yeah, returning for the first time since all this period. So you can see that Greece was a nation of emigrants. They mostly went to Australia, to the US earlier, to Germany. Ever since the 1990s, Greece became a nation of immigrants, people coming in after the fall of the Eastern Socialist bloc in Eastern Europe. So the first wave of influx was Balkan nationalities. We had a lot of Albanians, which is Greece to the north borders with Albania, what is now North Macedonia and Bulgaria, and to the east with Turkey. So the people from the north started coming into Greece, which was their first stop. Many of them lived for years and worked, but for at least 15 years, let's say as a landmark, 1991 until 2005, when the first coherent legislation was introduced, you can see a period of Greece actually not accepting the presence of these migrants. So, and this was bipartisan policy. In Greece, we were used to a two-party system, let's say, the center left and the center right, but both parties agreed that these people were like temporary. They would have to leave. And what is even more interesting or concerning is that the majority were Albanians. 60% of them were from Albania, a really poor country. And they were used as pawns, let's say, in a geopolitical confrontation that was really taking place between Greece and Albania, because there were some points of conflict. So for a period, I remember growing up as a teenager, there were like, you would have the police when there was tension between Greece and Albania. You would have the police doing, rounds and arresting everybody indiscriminately. They didn't have any form. They just had some temporary leave to work, some temporary permission to work. Their status was not yet regularized, but you would have the police doing mass sweeps and arresting hundreds of thousands of people and trying to deport them to Albania. So they were used in a purely geopolitical terms. If you do not do in Albania what we say, we will send them all back, something like that. So their status was regularized after 2005. So you have a period of 15 years, let's say, with the first laws. Then you have the second wave of immigrants coming in from Asia. Up until then, the migrants coming to Greece were from Eastern Europe. Then the second wave coming from Afghanistan, Pakistan, or from Sub-Saharan Africa. And then, of course, you have the Greek fiscal crisis, Greek economic crisis from 2010 up until officially 2019. This period, which was very traumatic in Greece, changed the perception of Greeks, their self-perception. Greeks usually take pride in being, tolerant and welcoming to strangers. There is this Greek word xenophobia, but there's also the Greek word philoxenia, which means to love, to embrace the stranger. So it has there are two phases to this. So this was an essential characteristic of the Greek self-perception of being welcoming. This was shattered during the economic crisis. Greeks were really angry at everybody, between themselves, at the government, at the EU, at Germany. There is an old, let's say, historical rivalry between Greece and Germany because we were occupied in World War II. So, the discourse was, okay, now the Germans telling us again, Fourth Reich coming back and stuff like that. And of course, you had a lot of anti-migrant rhetoric, very violent. And I will not sugarcoat it. We had a very extremist party in Greece, probably the most extremist in all of Europe, Golden Dawn. And this party had like 7% in the national vote, but its influence was even greater. Sometimes it would poll even at 12% and even higher. But they got mixed up in some, criminal activities, and the state cracked down on them. And luckily now their influence has waned and they're marginal now. So you can see this interplay of, let's say, the Greek self-perception, who we are. Greeks like to think themselves as, and they are, members of the European community. And this also leads to some sort of, compliance with EU modes, how we should treat migrants and so on. This collapsed during this period, but it was revived gradually as things became better. But then you had seminal events like the 2015 migration crisis in Europe. This was a large influx of over 1 million people coming into Europe. In Europe, there are three routes. The Western Mediterranean route, Morocco or Algeria, mainly Morocco, to Spain. The Central Mediterranean route from Libya, which is war-torn and actually there are no credible state structures, to Malta and Italy. And the Eastern Mediterranean route, either the land route or island route through Turkey, from Turkey to Greece, or from West Asia. So Greece back then received over 1 million migrants, and there was this great tension because Greece, of course, was totally unprepared. Greece is a nation of 11 million. It could not host so easily 1 million people. But of course, they didn't want to stay in Greece. They wanted to go to Germany, to Sweden, where they had networks. And there was this interplay the whole issue in concerning Greece or even Europe in general is, but let's talk about Greece, it's three levels. The national level. Greece tries to deal with the migration issue or the refugees as a state. How does it respond? What is the public perception? How good are its services towards migrants? Then you have the EU level. There is EU legislation that is common for all EU member states. For example, we're talking about this asylum applicants, their applications have to be over with a maximum of 20 months. It's a EU law that an application by an asylum cannot exceed 20 months. So I was kind of surprised to hear that in Australia, it's longer. And this, it's good for the asylum applicants because they have a limit anyway. After 20 months, it's illegal to cross this level. But sometimes, they limit the access by saying that you can appeal only twice. I don't know how is it in Australia and Europe. You can appeal only twice. If two times your application is rejected, then you are deported. So there is this interplay between the national level, the EU level, and an additional level is Greek-Turkish relations. Turkey being the country that controls migration flows towards Europe. And here we have a context of securitization of migration and sometimes even of engineered migration, because back in 2020, there was, just before the COVID virus, the pandemic broke out, there was an incident in the land borders of Greece and Turkey when you had, it was, I think, an attempt by the Erdogan regime to try to extract additional revenues, perhaps from the European Union, in terms of it had a deal, 2016 deal, European Union, Turkey. If the migrants or the refugees in Turkey will give you money, over 6 billion euros. And there was this attempt anyway to push people into European Union, into Greece. And this led to a kind of securitization of the whole thing, because Greece actually, it didn't accept them, closed the borders, and it even went on to suspend the right to asylum for 1 month, which was a very harsh move, but it was grounded on Vienna Treaty anyway, of a European treaty. But this was a very harsh move. It was not directed against the migrants. It was directed against Erdogan's Turkey. And later, the COVID broke out and things changed. So you see, what is my argument is that there is an interplay in Europe between geopolitics and migration. And of course, we can talk later about the politics of fear and how it influences not only public perceptions, but political outcomes. This is very big in Europe.
Thank you, Ioannis. That's really an excellent job of setting up a really complex recent history and making it clear for us. I want to pose two issues to you and the panel before we're opening it for questions on the floor. Thinking in terms of two time frames, the next 5 years and going 10 years out, we come to 2034. So what do you see the challenges we're facing nationally and globally over the next 5 years? This is a year of elections. We've got a rather important election coming up in November. We can talk about that. It's good to see that the focus of the Harris campaign has turned towards looking forwards, not going backwards, hope. I don't want to sugarcoat the challenges we're facing, but this question of optimism and hope is important to unpack as well. What foundation do we have? So first of all, what do you see the challenges of the immediate, 5 years to come? And what gives you some basis for optimism, reasonable basis for optimism, that in 10 years' time we're going to be in a better place?
One of the very few times that Karen asked me to go first. Thank you, Karen. Look, you mentioned the elections. We know that half the world population will be going to some form of election one way or another in 2024. And we also know that in most of those elections, migration is at the very center of public debates. That goes against, so In Australia, if you ask a lot of people about migration, they would either say it's really very important. It's so important that it explains why we have a housing crisis. It explains why we have cost of living crisis. It explains why there's, productivity problems, skills shortages, social cohesion, securitization. Or some other people would say, well, it's not a problem. I call it one of the paradoxes of migration debates here, that it's either the cause of all the ills that we have, or it is a panacea that can really solve all the problems that we have. And of course, the truth is neither here nor there. It's always somewhere in between. And the somewhere in between is really this. And we've seen this, by the way. In 23 and 24, we had two absolutely fundamental, important reviews. In 23, we had the Migration Systems Review. That's the government reviewing its migration policies, looking into what works, what doesn't work, looking at issues of mechanics and processes, but also looking into composition of various programs and looking into external dynamics, internal dynamics, looking into what is driving new patterns of mobility. That was a very comprehensive review, and I urge everyone to look at the report. And then, of course, just recently released, we had the Multicultural Framework Review, which was just been released. And of course, the minister who released it has been since replaced. But those two reviews are extremely important, and they really give us a lot in terms of thinking about where will we land in relation to migration policies. Of course, what's happened recently, and I've written about this in terms of opinion pieces, what's happening recently is we have now a race between the two major political parties in Australia, to go back to Greg's question, in terms of who's going to cut migration more and who's going to make more in kind of significant reshaping of the migration program, so that we have less international students, we have less skilled migrants, that we have less of this and less of that, yeah? And maybe there's some thinking that perhaps temporary migration could be the answer, that we can bring people on a temporary basis, they will feel certain shortages in the economy, they will respond to certain economic needs, and then we can always send them back when those needs are no longer there. So this is part of the thinking. I don't necessarily agree that that's what will happen, because it's far more complicated than that. And I can explain why it is far more complicated than that. So you take, for instance, the international student caps that have been recently announced by Minister Clare, that universities will have to reduce their international student enrollments from a certain number to a certain number, and a lot of the larger universities will be impacted because their 2019 numbers will no longer be the new capped quota in 25 and beyond. What we know already, as a matter of fact, is that the challenge is not actually about meeting quotas for those international students, because a lot of them, of course, will go on to become PRs, apply for permanent residency and stay here. And it is a highly, highly skilled, highly valuable source of migration for Australia, because they are highly qualified, no problems with English language. They immediately kind of fit into and adapt to the labor market conditions here. So they're contributors anyway. And there's some research that has shown that a lot of those migrants, on average, they contribute more than 126,000 more in tax payments than your average resident in Australia. So those people are much better tax contributors than average Australians who are not migrants. The problem is you will not be able to fill those quotas, even when they are reduced. And the reason is a lot of this negativity about migration in terms of linking it to securitization, as Jonas just alluded to in the context of Greece and Europe, in terms of linking it to a lot of infrastructure challenges that we face, whether it's housing, whether it's employment, whether it's all of those things are sending signals to an extremely competitive pool of talent globally, whereby other jurisdictions, whether it's in Canada or in Europe, in the Middle East, now increasingly in East Asia, where they are competing for the same pool of talent. Everyone wants the young and healthy and the educated. Everyone wants those people who can learn new skills very quickly. Everyone wants people who are able to adapt with the new economy, where I think AI and machine learning in general and generative artificial intelligence in particular is going to be driving economic productivity. And so what we are doing in Australia, Greg, to answer your question, is in many ways, we don't really have a lot in terms of shaping the numbers or shaping the components of the migration. All we are doing right now is actually damaging our capacity to continue to attract those people who can really make a contribution and who want the mobility. Actually, a lot of those people, and now Karen and I, of course, and I've got other colleagues here, and Santosh and Sharam in this meeting, we are leading a massive center of excellence on migration futures. And part of our argument for that massive center of excellence on migration futures is this, that there are new forms of mobility that are now being driven by new sets of conditions and new sets of variables, right? And a lot of these new forms of mobility are necessitating new ways of dealing with migration. It's no longer the traditional unidirectional linear migration process. Migrant X moves from country A to country B, and that's it, the end of the story, and they live happily ever after. That is no longer the case. There's now circular migration. There is migration where there's a number of secondary movements. There's a migration where actually you are immobile. That is, you don't actually move physically, and yet you are employed and contributing, and etc. A lot of these things are enabled by new digital technologies. They're enabled by new forms of flexibility in the workplace, and new industrial relation laws that many countries are now introducing. So that really looking forward in terms of what the migration program will look like in the future, it will not look like it was in the 90s or the 80s, or certainly what it was in the 40s and 50s. And of course, what the migration systems review that I alluded to earlier, and to give you a quote from the migration systems review, it says, our migration programs right now are not fit for purpose. What we have right now is not fit for purpose. It is broken, and it needs a major overhaul. And many countries are already embarked on that major reform and overhaul. And so, and in the context, I know that reform is very difficult in the context of politics. And I started at the beginning by talking about so many elections where migration is at the center stage. This is why the Labour government in Australia, and this is why the opposition, they are really right now in a competition who is going to make the biggest announcement in terms of cutting migration numbers. That's what they're doing. Why? Because they think that is a winner, electorally speaking, right? Rather than thinking really what works best for all concerned, not just us as a settlement country, but also in terms of those countries who send young people to study abroad. And of course, there is what migration is also a critical element of international development now through economic remittances, financial remittances of migrants. And we have figures from the World Bank. It's in excess of $300 billion. A couple of years ago, the figure of migrants sending money back to their home countries. That is much more than what the UNDP has been doing in terms of helping those countries. So it is a dimension of international development. It is the dimension of sustaining our social fabric and our economic prosperity. It is a dimension for regional cooperation and international relations. And it certainly is a dimension for ensuring that we also don't look at migrants in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. This is really important. And we've done this mistake over and over again. Migrants are individual human beings who've got agency. They make decisions to move from one place to a place for all sorts of reasons, including education, including fleeing persecution, including economic betterment, improving their lot. And unfortunately, we stopped a while ago looking at them as human beings, fellow human beings, and now we treat them in terms of really a zero-sum kind of gain analysis. And unfortunately, Greg, I don't see that changing in the current environment, even though you wanted an optimistic view. I don't see that changing. But what I can see is that in many ways, a lot of these negative noises that some politicians are making will not ultimately lead to those desired outcomes they are pursuing, simply for the reasons I've just outlined.
Thank you. So our policy mechanisms aren't fit for purpose, but also our political rhetoric doesn't really match the reality. But we have, between one side of politics being squared, of being wedged on this, politics of fear reacting, and the other side of politics feeling they've got a winner with this. Yeah, it's a very dysfunctional and unhelpful environment. Karen, can you cheer us up?
Yes.
No, sorry. I don't feel very optimistic at the moment because I feel like both sides of politics, and actually all sides of politics, not just the major parties, are kind of in alignment on the idea that there's too many. It's interesting if you look at the migration numbers over the last 20 years. There were a lot of years where we had a lot of migrants, large numbers. We might have 1 million people on sort of migration visas of various sorts here, new ones every year. No discussion, not part of the discourse. And yet now I wish I could be optimistic about it. I think, and I guess also in there is kind of the discussions of asylum seekers and refugees, and that's kind of gone silent in recent times, and that situation remains really bad. When Giannis is saying that they call what we do with detention centers the Australian solution, I was thinking, my God, that's horrifying. Because we let people languish in these places for years and years, and it's really inhumane, and we need to stop doing that. It's not a good approach. Does it reduce the number of people coming by boats? We don't even know. There are other things that affect whether or not people come by boats. So, and people can still come by plane, and people have the right to apply for asylum. People have the right to apply for asylum. It is a human right. And we should be doing much better in that regard. Not in the current discourse, huge in sort of the 2000, 2010, really, really big discussion, but not kind of in the current discourse. I think that I would love it if some of our politicians would be a bit brave and provide some visionary statements around what Australia should look like as a migrant receiving and welcoming country where people come and contribute to the economy. As I said, I'm doing research with Black African migrants and their political and economic agency here. People who have jobs, people are, they're paying remittances back to Africa. They're thriving here. They're providing, they're engaging in politics. They're running for office. They're voting, but they're also involved in politics in their home countries. It's good for Australia to have people who are connected in this way. It's good for us. That mobility is really important. But I'm not seeing any discussion of the benefits of migration in any of the political discourse. And it's a little bit depressing. Well, it's quite depressing because it is most of us have half of us have a parent, at least ourselves, or have a parent who is born overseas. It's huge. So I wish I could be a bit more optimistic, but I'm not seeing any sort of vision. And I feel like as citizens, we should be demanding more of our politicians in this regard.
What do you make of that, Ioannis? Is that's not surprising? It's stuff you're familiar with. Is there a difference in Europe? Are you sort of further along in this conversation, or are you dealing with the same politics of fear?
Yes, unfortunately, I would not be also not optimistic about what will happen in Europe over the next 10 years, let's say. The good thing, though, about Europe is that the European Union, has a coherent approach. It decides a policy and tries to implement it. Sometimes it fails, but there is an organized attempt on a macro, let's say, on a long-term level to implement this policy. Just last year, the European Union adopted a new policy on migration and mostly on refugees. And they said that because there were many disagreements between nation states, for example, Eastern European countries didn't want to take anybody in. So you had countries like Hungary or Poland or Slovakia fiercely resisting taking any refugees. So, and the European Union could not actually, it tried to threaten them and say, we'll put a fine on you for this issue. But because it's, politics, they need, in the European Union, you have the rule of anonymous vote. Everybody in the room has to agree. Even if one member state disagrees, things stop. So they need the unanimous vote for relations with Russia, let's say, for sanctions on Russia. You can see that also playing out in the case of Ukraine, Hungary again being the bad sheep, interestingly enough. So there is this interplay between foreign policy choices, even in the case of migration. So you have to accommodate everybody and to give them something. And that, as you understand, causes decisions to be taken in a belated manner. It takes many years to reach a coherent plan. For example, we had the influx, as I told you, in 2015, and just in 2024 they come up with an organized plan accepted by everybody, and this was done. This plan was done only by exerting a lot of pressure on Eastern European states. So, and again, some of them opted out. They said the plan is the following. The countries that are on the periphery, Spain, Italy, Malta, and Greece, receive the migrants and the asylum seekers. So these states are, let's say, overburdened with housing and applying care for those people. So the states of the periphery try to pressure the states of Northern Europe. Do your part. Take, migrants to your countries. And some states in Eastern Europe opted completely out and said, no, we will pay the fine. So the rule was, if you do not take any migrants or asylum seekers, you will pay, I think it's 20,000 euros per person. But Hungary said, no problem, we'll pay the fine. So this is really, you can see the discourse that is there. Some European states will fiercely resist this. Even Poland, even with a new government, before they had a populist center-right or right-wing government, now they have a liberal center-left to center government, but even the new government does continue more or less the same policy. So you have this pattern of differing not just opinions, but different handling of the migration and the refugees issue. As a pattern, Eastern European states tend to do not accept migrants. Germany and France face a growing internal dissatisfaction, let's say, on a political level with this issue, and this is something that they try to address. You saw perhaps in the news that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that now that we will deport immediately all migrants with criminal activity, no second chance, no money for you. And in France, of course, the issue has been highly politicized, leading to known political results. So I think that over the next period, European, and of course in the UK, which is not European Union, but you saw the latest, nasty events in the British cities. So I think the European Union, or Europe in general, will continue along the same pattern. That is my prediction, because the structure is there, and sometimes, it is portrayed as a fight of states against a center, an autarchic center, Brussels. Pretty much like, sometimes the discourse in the US is states against Washington, telling us what to do, something like that. So you have the same discourse in European Union, and populist parties take advantage of that, either on the left or on the right. It's interesting that sometimes they agree on this issue in Europe. So my prediction would be that over the next period, we will have like this kind of political fragmentation in Europe. We will see the rise of populist parties. It's a pattern everywhere now in almost all European countries. We will continue to see this because the issue has been portrayed as in almost exclusively in security terms or in cultural terms. There is also this aspect. There's a whole discourse in Europe about its identity. Post-Christian, what is the role of the Islamic elements? So all this, is very much discussed in Europe. Of course, we should remember that there is a great difference between Europe and Australia in the sense that European states are historically or have been developed as pretty much as ethnic states. They correspond to a nationality. They were not multi-ethnic states. Those that were broke up, like Yugoslavia, Austro-Hungarian Empire in the past. So there was this, let's say, corresponding pattern between a nation and its territory. And this has led to a different perception of identity than in Australia. Of course, you have exceptions like the United Kingdom, let's say the post-colonial states, United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany for different reasons. But throughout Eastern Europe, in Greece too, the pattern is different. The pattern is of a dominant ethnic group, let's say, that can welcome a limited number. But that's it. That's the majority view. And this is shared by along the political spectrum, although they will present it in different rhetoric. So this is my 2 cents on this. I think things in Europe will continue to present negative news, and there will be internal tension between the center, Brussels, the European Commission, and nation states and states on this. But of course, migration will not stop. And in Europe, as you know, we have the war in Ukraine, another very important issue. And this also has led to a kind of further securitization of the migration, not in the sense of the Ukrainian, not regarding Ukrainian refugees, because they were actually welcomed in Poland. They were taken care of in Poland, throughout Eastern Europe and in Greece, but more in terms of that the European states now think more in terms of security. There are talks we should return to, how you call this, drafts, national armies, where males go to, they have to go mandatory military service. We still have this in Greece and Austria, I think, but all other European states do not have it. So you can see this pattern of returning, of security becoming focal in discourse.
Yeah, securitization and nationalism. There's so much to unpack there. Thank you. That's a really very helpful summary. I'll take now some questions. I'll take, say, 3 questions from the floor so that we can be more efficient. So,
my name is Fotis Kapitopoulos. That's what I won't do that.
okay.
My name is Fotis Kapitopoulos. I'm from Neos Cosmos now, and I had a little bit to do with multicultural policy in the past. I know there's been a lot of bane towards politicians, but can I ask all 3 of you a question? One, where do you place, Professor, the vast number of convicts who didn't settle in Australia, who were brought here and used like slave labor? And for example, I find it interesting, this notion of settlement, when as a son of a migrant, we didn't settle here. We were pretty much bought from Greece at about £1 a head to run the industrial capacity of Australia's post-war development. And lastly, where's class when current ABS statistics show that you're probably far more likely to be poor intergenerationally if you're white and Anglo-Celtic than if you've come in as a migrant. Aspirationally, migrants ramp up dramatically. Fethi, question. I know you expect government for us to give you stuff, which is great, but I was going to ask something interesting. Multiculturalism was something that had developed originally. I mean, the oldest mosque is here, 100 years old, Logan Street. The Afghans opened up the desert. Greeks, there's Justice Kyrios have been here for 3 generations, 4 generations after they were expelled from Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. It was institutional completion of communities here, Greek, Italian, and others, that forced multiculturalism onto government. Our newspapers, our churches, our mosques were here way before Whitlam came on board, right? And it was interesting that with the White Australia policy, it was a recent event, it destroyed Chinatown. Chinatown was a thriving place here. Finally, to you, we've seen recently, since Charlemagne, Europe seems to have forgotten Greece and placed us back in some degrees to the Middle East, where we might belong as Asia. We've seen our gaze move again to the East, as we did in ancient times, towards India, towards China, pacts with Israel, pacts with Egypt. Do you foresee that movement to the East again, our natural proclivity to go to the East? And finally, we are a nation, I guess, in Greece, of migrants and diaspora. It could have been born by diaspora, just like Lebanon was and just like Israel was to some degrees. We're always multicultural. So please, that's it. That's enough.
That is enough. That's a solid basket of substantial questions. We've only got half an hour left. Are there any other questions before we? Yep. So we'll answer. We'll just take some questions first, just for efficiency. So over here, Kelly.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you, and welcome to our Greek contingent as well. If I could turn for us to reflect perhaps on an area that I've been studying quite a bit, but to think about diaspora, that is to say, both in a policy context, okay, so both how these nation states are increasingly engaging with those diasporas that are sending remittances and stuff, and this is increasingly becoming then a diplomatic tactic, if you will. But then on the human level, on the agency level, and intergenerational context, is to then say that increasingly the nation state, for many people, are not necessarily the gravity of their lives, and that they are moving in mind and body across these borders. And so without, realizing you don't work for government, that's not what you do, right? But to say then that there is an increased lack of new vernacular that I think we as academics could produce, right? To talk more constructively beyond what now seems to be quite dated talk of multiculturalism from a 70s framing. So, I mean, my probe here is to say diaspora is a useful concept, but it's also a lived reality that I think can play into how we're talking about these issues in a contemporary context, which clearly have a long history. But then also to say that what can we do, what type of work can we do in an academic context to give new language to re-enhance that issue with a rhetoric? Because our politicians, let's say, are not schooled in talking about this deep diversity, this super diversity that is on the ground in our lives every day.
Thank you. We've got some, that's an excellently provocative and constructively provocative question, and we've got some excellent questions here, so plenty to work with, not much time. We'll try and quickly get through some of these things that make sense.
Okay, I can start.
Lead off, please, Karen.
Yeah, so class is really important, obviously, in terms of diaspora. And in the post-war migrant period, it was unskilled labor that was brought over. And one of the things that happened in the 1970s were those ethnic communities that came over in the post-war period. They were here successfully. They were thriving, and that put pressure on the Australian state to that was one of the pressures, and to get rid of the White Australia policy. So it is. I think class is actually really important. The skilled migration policy that came in the 1970s meant that the non-white migrants that have come in for the past 40 years are highly skilled people. And they actually, so we would expect them to be doing well in the economy because they are highly skilled. We've rigged it that way. They should be doing well. One of my PhD students was doing some research on highly skilled migrant women, and she looked at migrant women from China, Philippines, India, and the UK. The British ones had labor market advantages. They got extra good stuff in the labor market, and all the other three groups had disadvantages, despite the fact that they were highly skilled. So given their human capital, they should have been higher up than where they were. So I think we have to also look at human capital things. And Donis, I think your question is a really good question. I think it kind of goes to what Fetty was saying about the ideology of multiculturalism, and actually what does that mean and how we use it to structure our everyday life. And what Fetty was saying about kind of, we say we're multicultural, but actually none of our institutions haven't actually embraced it. Underpinning all of that is this kind of this still deep whiteness and a valorization of the white history of this country that shapes things and shapes people's opportunities today. Diaspora, I think, can be a useful thing. But I think about myself. So I'm Jamaican. I'm from Jamaica. And I'm also American. My family migrated to the U.S. when I was 10, and then I've migrated here. There's no Jamaican diaspora here. I don't have access to my ethnic community. Limited access in California, to be honest. My parents did have some West Indian friends, and the American diaspora just isn't a thing. It's not, I know some American people. We're not organized. We don't have an ethnic community here either. And so I think why do ethnic communities come? Because people in particular ethnic communities need that support to live in this environment.
Yeah, look, thank you for the question. I think the issue of what do you expect from government? Do you expect a lot from government? Is not one that academics will necessarily agree with, because actually we think a lot of the problems that we are seeing right now in our society, not just society as in Australia, but the global community in general, have been really problems that reflect in many ways not the best of policy making, to be honest with you. And that may well be because we are social scientists and we are inherently critical of things, and we want always to see the best possible outcome. But I want to link your question with the other question too, and just say a few words about why we are where we are right now. And I think it is actually a failure to appreciate that the Westphalian nation-state system that we have inherited and has been very dominant for centuries now, 3 centuries at least, is no longer really adequately serving us as a global community. I mean, there's whichever way you look at it, whether globalization has stopped at the level of freedom of goods and services to circulate, but not freedom of human beings to circulate. That is the classical kind of critique. But more importantly, the nation state is founded on the basis of this territorially bounded community. We are no longer able to really say that we operate in a world that can preserve that kind of territoriality in a way that is fixed, in a way that dictates who's in, who's out. You mentioned your background. I am originally from Tunisia. I did not come here as a migrant. I was on a PhD scholarship. I went to Asia and then came to Australia to study. I never intended on staying here. It's just that life happened and I stayed here. Now, I'm saying that for a reason. It's because I don't necessarily feel I need to connect with the larger Tunisian community or Arabic community, whatever here. I feel I am a member of a global human community with whom I share certain values, certain aspirations, certain fears, and with whom I identify. So if it happens that I meet someone who's nice, of Tunisian Arabic background, albeit, if it doesn't happen, it makes no difference to me. I define myself in relation to my ethical orientations, not my nationality or my passport.
You're not an Arab that's come here to work.
If you want to put the class lens on it, feel free to go ahead and do it. All I'm saying is, what should motivate this kind of thinking really is to think of others, and Karen referred to asylum seekers, and look at them as fellow human beings first and foremost, not either fellow citizens or fellow co-ethno-nationalists, because that is extremely exclusivist as a language. It's extremely damaging as a discourse. It's what creates oppression. It's what creates discrimination. It's what creates divisions in societies, right? And you made a few mentions of particular societies which are inherently multicultural, inherently this or that. As a matter of fact, migration has been with us for millennia. It's nothing new. The Islamic calendar is called Hijrah. Hijrah means migration. It is nothing new. Human beings have eternally longed for mobility. They wanted to move, whether because they wanted different pastures for their thing or whether because they were looking for better climates or better. So that is a fundamental human tendency, and therefore it should be a fundamental human right. The reason why we're having these problems now in Europe, in Greece, and elsewhere is because we are superimposing a set of man-made, I call them injunctions, like really almost wake up and make some laws that this particular ethnicity should not come in. But that one, you mentioned the Ukrainians are welcome. Why the Ukrainians are welcome in Europe, but not the Syrians, but not the Gazans or the Palestinians? Think about that for a moment. It is not because one people are better than other people. It's because of who we define is more deserving of our empathy and care, and who we define is not deserving of our empathy and care simply because they don't look like us, they don't sound like us, or they don't pray for the same God as us. And this is where I go back to what I said earlier. That's precisely why I like to identify in relation to global ethics and global citizenship. Because fundamentally, there's plenty of things that everyone on this planet Earth can share if they want to. And then just one final word about migration and why what's happening around migration. Just think about the problems. You mentioned France and Germany. And I can go on and say, add to that Britain and Belgium. And a lot of those countries are colonial powers who went into Africa, who went into Asia and colonized people, subjugated them, looted their resources, went back after so-called independence, really never got full independence anyway, and then started bringing laborers as they needed them. France have right now more than 5 million North African workers in France. They still treated today as second citizens, even if you are born in France. And I've done a lot of research on Maghrebi migrants in France. Germany have the Turkish problem. The UK has the Pakistanis and the, I mean, come on. This is not a good look for the so-called global North countries, because they're only instrumentalizing and dehumanizing people who they've exploited for centuries, if not millennia. Not millennia, because then we'll go back into a different story. But really, we need to come back to reality here. That for us to make, this is why a lot of these things, Greg, you said earlier, will not make sense in the short term, because fundamentally, unless we understand the states of play globally, and unless we understand why we have entrenched inequalities in our global systems, which then are reflected in entrenched inequalities within societies, we're not going to make any progress. We will still have divisions, we'll still have racism, we'll still have oppression, we'll still have security issues, simply because we are not really coming to grips with the fundamental root causes of these issues, which is that we have not really came out of the full legacies of colonialism. And then it goes back to your thing, right? Your question, which is a very good question, by the way. We need a new vernacular, new language to make sense of what's going on. And for me, it's embracing and understanding what it means to live transnationally. That's what it comes to. We all lead transnational lives these days. I mentioned my background. I'm in constant contact with my family. I'm going there on the weekend. So we are all now mobile, and I appreciate why you were saying middle class, because I can do that. But it is part and parcel of who we are nowadays, that we want to really be transcending those fixed boundaries of the nation state. They're no longer relevant in many ways, but the state is still keen on making them relevant through some of these measures that have been referred to. Sorry if I took too long. I didn't mean to.
No, it's given what you've just covered, that's very efficient. Johannes, how do you respond to that?
Yes. Concerning your observation about the need for perhaps a new vocabulary or academic terms, I would say that in Europe, because we haven't, and especially in Greece or other countries of Eastern Europe, for example, we don't have so much advanced structures in terms of multicultural policies. So we cannot be compared to the Australian case. So this would be rather ambitious in, in the case of, in our case. So, our interpretative framework is different still. So you still have to implicate the institutions. You still have to change public discourse and later move to this. This is for more advanced multicultural states like Australia. Now, coming to the two questions concerning Greece in particular, Greece has the first one was about foreign policy, if I remember correctly. Yes. Yes, and you mentioned first to make the question in context. He was referring to a book issued back in the 1980s by Di Rosel. It listed Greece as not belonging to European civilization. And they said European civilization began with Charlemagne. So this was, it didn't make any news in Europe, but in Greece it made big news because it totally disregarded the Byzantine Empire, Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire, of course, ancient Greece. But this was like an exclusionary perception of European identity by, let's say, Western European elites. So Greece has adopted a pragmatic, let's call it, foreign policy, and it traditionally had excellent relations with the Arab states. Lately, since the 2010, after we had this crisis I told you before, this crisis affected also Greek self-perception in terms of foreign policy. Until then, Greece was like, we are members of the European Union, period. After the crisis, Greece began saying, oh no, we are also a member of the Mediterranean unity. And it improved relations drastically with Israel, with Egypt, but also keeping excellent ties, with Arab states and populations. It ameliorated its relations with China. Sometimes the European Union accuses us of being the back door of China into the European Union. We had a deal with the port of Piraeus. Piraeus is the biggest port in Greece, and now it's become number 5 in whole of Europe. And this has to do with Chinese investment. So you see a state trying to take, let's say, to make good use of its special geographical position to try to do the best. And your other question was about the identity of Greeks and the notion of diaspora, if I remember correctly. And of course, as Feti previously said, migration has been going on for millennia. Greeks actually came to Greece. They are Indo-Europeans. This linguistic unity, they originated probably from Ukraine. So they descended in Greece. So they were the first migrants themselves. And Greeks were always a nation of migrants around the Mediterranean, to the east, here. So I think this is a lesson that we all need to keep in mind. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good reminder, that longer view of a more complex reality. We've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So, Simon, and is there any one question over here? Right, okay, we'll take both questions together and that should do us nicely.
Thank you for great presentations all and great questions as well. For the sake of brevity, I'm probably going to simplify my question to the point of unhelpfulness. But how do we cosmopolitans convince skeptics and those hostile to migration that we can be good patriots and good civic nationalists? It seems to me that's not something that we've done very well over a period of time. And I wonder also about how do we deal with the question of the ongoing crisis, which is capitalism? It's mostly crisis punctuated by periods of peacefulness. To just choose one example, American workers haven't had a pay rise since the mid-1970s. And so that frustration seeks an outlet, and it's very obviously easy to manipulate that. So how do we address the kind of crises in capitalism as well to convince people that you're looking in the wrong places for your answers?
I don't have a question, but I just want to have some overly positive note with all these discussions, the politics of from politics of fear to politics of hope, that this idea is generated on security danger. You know, any politics come, any election come, and we have the boat people, and they make elections win. And I think this is not because of the evidence, but lack of evidence about this. No, I haven't seen even one person getting visa here who is a danger to the security. So it is a lack of evidence. And secondly, media plays a role. So what we need is the evidence, and secondly, training the media people on migration technicalities and the Center of Excellence bit that Fatty is leading. I think we are going to provide both that, and then that would be a positive outcome, which I hope. Thank you.
I mean, your question is goes to the heart of a lot of these issues we are discussing right now. But just the challenge that you've posed to us, which is how do we convince those people who are the powers that be about the value of what it is we are talking about tonight, this evening. In a way, Santosh is right. There's always an absence of, if I can use this word between inverted commas, neutral empirical evidence on what works, what doesn't work, what is the benefit of certain policies as opposed to the potential detriment or the potential disadvantage that those policies can do. And by all accounts, and I've looked at a lot of studies that have been done in terms of measuring the impact of migration. I'm focusing on Australia, but you can really extrapolate from that in relation to other jurisdictions, whether it's Greece or other places. And by all accounts, when you look at the impact of migration, and focusing on Australia for a minute, it has been the driver of our prosperity for decades now. Fortis was alluding to Greeks and Southern Europeans in the 50s, and he's right, in the 50s and 60s, that's how we started to see the benefits of migration. That's what started to show the government that they needed to change tack, and it coincided with other things, but they're absolutely right there. That if you look at it right now, fertility rates in Australia, if you take migration out of the equation, we will be shrinking. Exactly, we will be shrinking as a population. That means two things. It means, one, we will no longer be able to offer the same quality of life to people in terms of service provisions. To give you an example, because we are talking in Greek here, in Greece, Greek aged care provision in Australia will collapse tomorrow if we stop bringing Greek nurses from Greece to service a lot of these, and in Indian too. Thank you, Fortis. But I know that because I had a lot of discussions with Frontitha, one of the largest providers of aged care for Greek, right? Just to give you an example. So if you stop that, we will have a huge crisis tomorrow, immediately, which will not be able to remedy whichever way we look. So that's an example. And the other thing is, of course, with migrants, if we were to stop because of the other problem in our population, and where there will not be enough taxpayers to sustain many of us who will probably be retiring in the next 10 or 15 years or 20 years, right? So you are structurally in a position that you cannot sustain neither the social and cultural fabric nor the economic prosperity that you took for granted for a long time. And that, by the way, it's not me saying it, as perhaps people think I'm pro-migration academic. No, this is evidence that's been produced by think tanks and by ABS and by other organizations. So we have a lot that we can use to make the case. Unfortunately, and again, it's been said a few times, because of the media landscape that is dominated by the here and now and the sensational coverage of these issues, and because of an electoral cycle, in particular in Australia, which is very short, 3 years and we go again for elections, 3 years and we go again, no government is keen or interested in doing the proper work that needs to be done.
You've lost one bulwark. The greatest bulwark against migration still right now that we face,
Yeah.
and have faced since the last 100 years, are the unions.
Yeah.
Unions do not want skilled labour in here.
Yeah.
The unions do not want Greeks or Irish, which are considered black, or Italians in their unions.
He's right. Fortis is right on that front too. No, you're right. No, I'm talking about policy, but you're right about that point, of course, yeah. And we've seen the campaigns. We've seen the campaigns, and yeah, absolutely. No, that's a fair point. So yeah, basically, we are in a situation where a lot of what we are seeing is, as I said, a race to the bottom. Basically, who's going to make the biggest announcement to win the largest share of votes, because we have an electorate, unfortunately, which is whether it's ignorance, whether it's racism, whether it's whatever you want to call it, is right now doesn't have the appetite for having a mature, informed conversation that is based on research and empirical evidence.
I think that the kind of discourse we have, anti-migrant discourse at the moment, is really quite damaging. And I'm thinking particularly about the international students, because they are global cosmopolitans. They can go anywhere. They're not going to come here if we treat them as a cash cow, especially an unwanted cash cow. And when they start talking about, oh, the international students would do courses that will fill our skills needs, that's completely misreading it. International students, 85% of them go back or go elsewhere. It's not a migration market. A bit of it's a migration market, but most of it is actually an education market, because there's not enough high quality education providers in China and India and places like that. So they come here to get their education, but they go back. And they don't have to come here. They could go to Canada, the US, the UK, China. They can go lots of other places now because they can afford it there. And, you know, we make it hard. They're not going to want to come here. And that will have long-term effects for us. They are some of the best migrants we have because we have trained them up through our education system. You know, they're excellent. So I feel like the question about the global, you know, how do we, clearly evidence isn't adequate. Otherwise people would be convinced. Because if it was just, you know, I think academics, we have a problem here, like, oh, we'll just show them the evidence and they'll be able to tell that this is what we should do. Literally, we could show them the evidence and be like, oh yeah, no, I don't think I want to do that. And so it's a political problem. It is literally it's about power relations. It's about perceptions of how we want to be as a society, and of political parties for how they're going to get elected, and how do you turn this into a positive electoral issue? You know, it's a good question. Look at Japan, which has historically had no migration, their aging society, very, very low birth rate, labor shortages. You know, we just have, you know, still organized around an ideology of cultural homogeneity, finally opening up a bit, but, you know, is it too late? I don't know.
Largest labour shortages here are in the building and construction, not in academia and not in IT. I mean, the latest numbers give out. Sorry,
I totally take your point. Yeah.
I mean, skilled migrants as students is fantastic. As a cash cow for universities should be fees to supply and buy huge properties and have a huge stamp in our property market. But what we really need, and what we're crying out for, is labour.
And our migration policies don't prioritize unskilled labour.
Prioritise skilled labour, which have put pressure on current ministers not to allow labour market with skilled labourers from Korea, Vietnam, and China to come in.
Not on the skill list. It's a political question.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I'll tell you because in the most recent discussions and even the last 3 years, we had 775,000 migrants come from the end of COVID onwards. Huge number. The largest period of migration in Australia was under John Howard. Every year, close to 240,000. What's happening right now?
Who also undermine the rhetoric of multicultural.
Yeah, anyway, the unions, for example, have put so significant pressure on both Liberal and Labor governments not to allow skilled, particularly Korean, Vietnamese, and Chinese workers for building construction industry, because they'll undermine the wages in their mind and break up the unions of the labour industry.
You would know better than anyone that unions might have some influence over labor. They should not have any influence on liberal governments. I'm sorry to say
They
that.
have a lot of influence over liberal governments. They're scared.
But exactly. So yeah, it's a.
You ask one quick last word. Yes.
First of all, I think that we should not disregard the worries, you know, of people concerning migration. Sometimes academics tend to
totally avoid the issue, or fear of that we should not deal with this issue because it's connects to racism or whatever. And this is wrong, because all the worries should be addressed, and they should be addressed with a set of evidence, empirical evidence, and this can be done on the academic level, and on a government level. The government perhaps could, present with graphs, with data, how migration has benefited, so that it could be like a public campaign, I don't know, to spread more public knowledge of this issue. But it would be a huge mistake to, avoid the issue, because it would create that was like the mistake that for some time Hillary Clinton did, calling deplorables a large part of the population. The people who react to that, you cannot avoid that. So it would be a huge mistake. And of course, one last remark is, of course, interaction, human interaction. We are here invited by Greece, by a group of, by the Turkish community. Greece and Turkey, they have been historical rivals. There were different perceptions between Turks, what to expect coming sometimes as political refugees in Greece, or Greeks of Turks. And, interaction is always, I think, the best solution.
Thank you. Brilliant note to finish on. Thank you to all the panel.